Hello, everyone, and happy Women's History Month. Thank you for joining us today for a Korean Feminism panel featuring the Women's Resource Center and the Feminist Research Institute. Today, we will not only be celebrating the feminist work being done, but also have some critical conversations on how queerness, not only as an identity, but possibly a political statement, is integrated into feminist work, not only at UNM, but in a lot of other places. With that, my name is Pico Villa, pronouns they, them. I will be the moderator for today's panel. I'm a master's student in the Chicanic Studies Department and a graduate assistant for the UNM LGBTQ Research Center. And most importantly, I'm a Chicanx feminist. Today, I have the honor of introducing you to our panelists, who are all directors of some amazing departments and resource centers here at UNM. First, we have Jessica Holland, director of the Women's Resource Center. Jessica Hidalgo Holland enters her fourth year as the director of the UNM's Women's Resource Center, one of the oldest campus-based women's centers in the country and one of the first victim service agencies in Albuquerque. Prior to UNM, Jessica spent 15 years working in a variety of capacities within the nonprofit sector. The first part of her career was in New York City at Tides Foundation and Third Wave Fund coordinating funding initiatives focused on drug policy reform, Native youth environmental justice, and youth-led gender justice work. In 2010, Jessica moved to New Mexico to study trauma at the New Mexico School of Therapeutics in Southwestern College. Her work with victims of violence in Albuquerque's SANE Collaborative led to her involvement with the UNM SMART team and introduction to the Women's Resource Center. Next, we have Dr. Galarte, director of the Feminist Research Institute. Francisco J. Galarte is an assistant professor of the American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches courses in Chicanx, Latinx, and transgender studies. He is also the director of the Feminist Research Institute at the University of New Mexico. Last, we have Frankie Flores, director of the UNM's LGBTQ Research Center. Frankie Flores, they, is a first-generation Mexicano from Santa Rosa, Chihuahua. They grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the East San Jose barrio. Frankie grew up in a community surrounded by queer and trans people, thus propelling their commitment to trans justice, especially for trans women of color. Frankie is currently the director of the University of New Mexico's LGBTQ Research Center. If you have any questions for the panelists, we will be addressing them in the last minute of the panel. You can leave your questions in the chat box, or if you are tuning in from Facebook, go ahead and leave your questions in our comments section. We are streaming this live from Facebook at our UNM LGBTQ Research Center page. And just a reminder for me and the panelists, we will have interpreters for this panel discussion, so I ask that we keep that in mind while we are talking. Let's try to keep our talking at a moderate pace. So for my first question, it is, what is your relationship to feminism and how has it evolved over time?
Let me start. We to discuss this. Hi, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here. When I first read that question, the first thought that my mind was, it's complicated, right? My relationship status with feminism is complicated. I grew up and was raised by women of color, queer women who were constantly breaking barriers, who were challenging cultural and religious norms, gender norms, all of that every single day. And I also knew from an early age that grassroots movement building, usually led by women of color and queer activists, was the path that I believed true change was going to happen. And that's how we were going to build the world that we're trying to create. But feminism itself, as a word and as a label, was really something I wasn't comfortable embracing and claiming until after college. And it wasn't that I was denying it. It wasn't that I wasn't already living an activist, like feminist life, surrounded by feminists from lineages of feminists. But when I was younger, I think I really let what others thought of the word, how they embodied feminism, how the media portrayed it. That was really informing my relationship. And I wanted to acknowledge that because I think you can be a feminist and still have a very complicated relationship with the word, with the movement, with how others act it and embody it. And for me now, it's very personal, it's very public because of my job, but it still remains complicated. And those are kind of my thoughts on it.
Thank you, Jessica.
I can chime in here as well. For me, my relationship to feminism, when I thought of this question, I wanted to pinpoint kind of a coming into consciousness moment around what I understood, feminism to be and my relationship to it. And really, I couldn't necessarily pinpoint that moment. What I found myself thinking more about was thinking about my intellectual introduction to feminism through feminist theory and feminist writers, and the earliest one of those would be Gloria Anzaldúa for me. But then I also think about the women in my life growing up in the borderlands, and having very strong matriarchal figures in my life, and really kind of enacting an embodied kind of praxis, a lived they lived the feminist life in ways that really kind of were grounded in their everyday lives. So it wasn't definitely not kind of the liberal feminist figures that we saw or kind of get attached to what we think of feminism, or what I think my students often, when they don't know a lot about feminism, think about 1970s kind of bra burning moment. So, that definitely was never feminism for me. I think feminism was always kind of rooted in a place, in the place that I grew up, and the women in my lives, and learning from, folks who identify as feminists, and myself being a trans man, feminism, my duty to live a feminist life, I think becomes even more so, it becomes multiplied in terms of enacting feminism, and then continuously pushing myself to interrogate my relationship as a masculine identified person in relationship to feminist politics.
I think for me, feminism has, like Francisco, it's always been a part of my life, even though that hasn't been exactly the word for it. I think that my big introduction to it was in middle school with Sandra Cisneros, and not just House on Mango Street, but Woman Hollowing Creek, and really thinking about what it meant, and also having an understanding that particularly women's reproductive justice has been a big passion of mine, because I knew at an early age that if women had no control over their bodies, that as a brown queer person, I was going to have less control over my body. And so, reproductive justice is really the roots of my activism. So my activism is really rooted in feminism. And I was able to, to cultivate that through high school gifted classes as well, and kind of do that exploration of reading feminism, and then, entering UNM, right, being a women's studies major, and getting to really have a broader understanding of what feminism is. And also just a quick shout out to the WRC, because it was the WRC's 40th anniversary celebration. I got to meet Gloria Steinem, who, is a bit contentious, but also I was really humbled by the fact that she was able to sit and have those hard conversations around her previous transphobic experiences, and her apologies for that. And, I think that moment was really definitive for me in understanding the ways that feminism has to evolve and grow.
Thank you so much, everyone. I always love to hear people's developed relationships to feminism in their stories. So my next question is, how can faculty, staff, and students support and uplift LGBTQ populations at UNM?
I can start on this one. Yeah, that's awkward. It's an awkward dance, right? I think that one of the biggest ways is for students, staff, and faculty to take our Safe Zone training at the Resource Center. You know, it's a 4-hour training. It's comprehensive, and I think it gives and I mean, I'm biased because I do the training, but it gives a moment for us to be able to understand trans and queer issues in a very holistic way. You know, because I think that so much of what we understand trans and queerness to be is through word of mouth, through friends, through TV, through media, right? And we don't always, and that's not always right, the greatest source of information. And I also think that, you know, affirming people's pronouns and understanding that queer and trans identities is not static. It is a constant evolving issue. And it's a constant and evolving phase in our lives. And honoring the fact that some of us don't come into our queer or transness until we are in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s even, you know, and that's okay. There is no like time limit or cutoff period for being trans or queer.
I'll chime in, take the middle spot again. I think for me, for faculty, my role as a faculty member, I think, you know, affirming LGBTQ populations happens just literally in the classroom and in how we understand our pedagogy, right? So not normalizing heterosexuality as kind of the standard norm, you know, really kind of affirming sexuality as a category itself that is continuously changing, that isn't rooted in essentialisms, right? So not making statements that really kind of are going to make heterosexuality the logic by which we're going to understand a variety of concepts. And this goes not only from women and gender studies, but in the sciences, right? So if I'm, you know, teaching biochem and I am using, you know, examples to teach my students that are going to depend on, you know, gendered examples, or, you know, heterosexuality might make its way into an example I'm trying to give by, you know, ascribing that naturalness to heterosexuality, it creates a problem for students who don't identify as heterosexual and kind of are bombarded by heterosexuality in the world that we live in. And then on the other hand, it's also, you know, being affirming sex positivity among my students, right? Like, so, you know, understanding issues of consent, making sure that the things that we talk about in the classroom, what that looks like. Also, you know, being diverse in the type of text that I show. So not being afraid to teach texts that have sexuality in them, right? Finding texts that students can see themselves in. And then also really understanding that some students are coming to the university and maybe are not out, right? And so their home lives might not be places where they are safe, and learning content that is like LGBT based may not be something that's safe for them to do at home either, right? So being capacious in the expectations that we have and the demands that we place on our students. And then also listening, and as Frankie mentioned, you know, affirming pronouns and all of, and you know, how students want to be represented and represent themselves to you. So I think for faculty to affirm LGBTQ populations, it's really easy to do. It's just unfortunate that a lot of folks don't want to make that jump to be able to do so.
Yeah, thank you both for that. Going last means a lot of the wisdom has been shared, and I echo everything you said. And I think just to reinforce for me, there's something so simple, the advice in terms of listening and validating, because being seen, being heard, being accepted, feeling like that you belong, those alone are just such huge, powerful things that often a lot of us haven't experienced consistently in life. So I think just that showing up is really good. I also think my second kind of piece of advice would be to be humble in your listening as well, and to be willing to really seek education for yourself. I've been doing gender justice work from like an activist framework for almost 2 decades, maybe over 2 decades, and I still mess up. And there's still conversations that I can feel my heart start beating because I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I might, do something wrong or misrepresent feminism or all of those things. And I think what I would encourage our faculty, staff, and students is that in those moments where you're feeling confusion or you're sensing defensiveness come up, or you're really feeling lost around how to best support and show up for our LGBTQ members in this community, to first to know that's okay and that it's normal, but to also know that there are places on our campus like the Safe Zone training, like our centers, like Fry, where people are anxious and waiting to have those scary conversations. And so just to reach out for us, and when we're on campus, show up, and we welcome you, and we really welcome, that space to be of support so that you can show up the best way possible.
Thank you all so much for that advice and educational pointers. So my next question is, feminist, queer, and trans politics have worked side by side and at times have worked against each other. How do we hold space for contentious histories such as these in order to move the work forward?
I'll go ahead and start this time. It looks like we're alternating. So for me, when I think of, the contentious histories between feminist, queer, and trans political movements, I think as early back as second wave feminism and the sex wars, right? And, really kind of understanding what is the object of struggle that a movement is organizing around, right? So like during the second wave feminism, was a particular understanding of feminism that was about affirming womanhood in a very kind of biologically essentialist way. And it was also very sex negative, right? And also not queer positive at all. And I don't think that we're very far from that in our contemporary moment, because sex panics continue to happen every era that we're in, right? In our contemporary moment, there is a particular sex panic in the way in which we understand or treat sex work, say for example. And I think like sex work and that particular labor form is something that we often don't consider as falling under the rubric of feminism in ways that are not about saving narratives, but rather are about understanding how various folks who do sex work are often ignored or kind of sidelined by queer and feminist movements, precisely because they're subjects who are not thought of to be like the ideal kind of poster figures for these movements, right? When we think about trans politics, we can think of figures like Silvia Rivera. We can think of like these figures who, lived through sex work, right? And sex work was something that was political and politicized them in particular ways, right? So I think learning from, understanding that particular labor form, can really teach us a lot about where feminism needs to go, and how we can think about the object of feminism, right, being something that is much more capacious than, a biological kind of understanding of what it means to be a woman. And I think trans politics teaches us that really well, and its focus on really kind of alleviating and conditions and decriminalizing sex work is a really good start to improving a lot of folks' lives, not only trans people, but other people who, use this particular form of work, and, may not want to, it may not be a form of work that they want to ever kind of move out of or from, and that's okay. Right. So really kind of understanding the nuances in terms of political struggles is a way to push it forward, to look back and to speak with each other around the object of activism or the end goal.
Thank you, Frank. I really appreciate how you brought up the nuances, especially in feminist work, which is, I feel like, something we all struggle with. But I feel like it's really important to recognize that.
Yeah, I was so grateful to see this question because it's something I wrestle with a lot, and not just like historical wrongdoings, right, and reparative work that needs to happen, but the fact that, even in this present moment, like harm's still happening, and some of it intentional, some of it not, and how do we kind of heal and rebuild as a movement when it's absolutely critical that we're showing up right now. I think in terms of the how do we hold space, I've really learned kind of over the decades that there's so many different roles that we can all play in this movement, in both like the advancement, but also the reparative work. And it can look different, our roles, depending on what spaces we're in, what we feel comfortable with, what chapter of our lives are in, right? And we shouldn't expect us all to kind of hold every single piece. I am in such awe of this generation, like millennials and Gen Z, and their ability to call things out and to demand, like, no, we're not waiting for slow change, we want it now. And like, I honor that and I love it. And it's also not my comfort zone, right? Like that's, thank goodness we have, those activists in the field. For me, WRC has been such this unique kind of experience because it's very clearly a feminist like an agency, our culture, our model, our theory of change, our history, but we're also based on a college campus, and we're here to be of service to everyone, right? Like everyone, no matter their relationship to feminism, which, I said mine's complicated. So imagine what everybody here is. And I think that's been such a unique orientation to this work for me, because before I was always in, very explicit radical feminist spaces where no matter what I said, I know everybody was kind of on the same page, and it was very easy to just put blinders on, right, to everything else. And I think what shifted for me when I took this position, when I applied for it, and I kind of stepped into leadership was I saw it as my responsibility, right? This is a personal choice, that it's a time where I really want to work on calling people in and like doing the call in work. While I still love that the call out work's going, I think that's my role, is some of the calling in and being able to listen and honor the critiques, right? The pains, the fears, like everything that everybody is kind of carrying in their system, and being willing to sit with it, even with, the people and the beliefs that aren't normally comfortable with me. I'm quick to block on social media, but that's not an option, right? That's not an option in the work I do, and that's not really an option if we want to continue to build strength and repair. So I think it's really knowing what you're comfortable with and engaging in that way. But also if you are somebody who's willing, and I'm not saying having the extreme, like there's extremists in every single movement, and I'm not necessarily saying that's the audience I'm focused on calling in. But I do think, some of the divisions that we encounter on face are not necessarily value-based, and not necessarily about us trying to create different versions of a world. It's rooted in other stuff, and being willing to sit with that and sit in that discomfort is a piece that I think is needed in healing and repairing and growing together.
Yeah, no, I agree with both Frank and with Jessica. So I think, but I also think though that part of the ways that we hold these contentious histories together is by acknowledging them, and by not skipping over the fact that, at times we have fought side by side, and at times we have fought against each other as well. And I think that within the, the queer community in particular, really kind of just reflecting on the fact that there is misogyny in all cultures, right? And particularly in queer culture, a lot of times queer men have been really misogynistic. And I think that there is this almost this false narrative that because you are queer and mask, man identified, that because you're queer, it absolves you of your patriarchal attitudes, it absolves you of your misogyny, and it doesn't. And as somebody who, I have been very vocal about my feminism from a very early age, and have worked really hard to unpack and dismantle my own patriarchal misogynistic attitudes, I still benefit from those, and I still enact those, right? And I think that as a leader, not just in this campus, but in a larger context, it's important for me to acknowledge those moments, right? And I think that's important for us to say, you know, I mean, for example, a couple of months ago, I had a moment with Jessica where I really stepped in it. And I was just like, oh no, I'm really sorry. Like, let me, you know, we have to be able to admit our wrongdoings. And sometimes when we do those things, you know, we are able to show our elders that it's okay to make those mistakes and to move forward. And I think that we model that behavior for not just ourselves and for younger folks, but for older folks. You know, and I go back to the story about Gloria Steinem. You know, WRC did a meet and greet at the faculty club, and I went in ready to like just have it out with Gloria Steinem because I was just like, why not? It's a free ticket. And Gloria Steinem really, it was a moment of humility for me. And because she was like, you're right, let's sit down and talk about this. And I was like, oh no, I don't know if I have all my talking points ready. Like I was ready to be, I was on the defense and I wasn't ready to have a conversation. And we had a conversation, and it was, you know, I think one of the moments I will always cherish in my life. But it was a really good example of the ways that we can say, yes, we've messed up. Now, how do we move forward? And also, you know, I agree with Jessica. Like, I'm really enamored with the fact that younger folks are saying, we're not going to tolerate this. And we're not going to sit and figure out kind ways. Because sometimes, yes, kindness works, but kindness only gets us so far. You know, and a revolution has not really progressed because of kindness. And we have to acknowledge that also. And that sometimes is challenging being on a university campus, because I want to be radical, but I also want to pay rent, you know? So, and we have to like balance both of those. And I think that to me is like the essence of feminism, right? Is how do we balance those spaces that we're in?
Thank you all so much. And I just want to bring up a point that both Jessica and Frankie brought up, is this third space. And I'll quote, oh my God, I'm sorry, Gloria Anzaldua's Coatlicue state that, you know, the third space is the uncomfortable space that can really bring transformative change. And I think that's a really important point to bring up, in that the only way that feminism can really develop is if we really place ourselves in that uncomfortable space and see how we can both step back and provide for the movement. So I thank you all for bringing up really great points. So my fourth question is, what are pressing feminist, queer, and trans issues that we need to be talking about in this political moment?
Jessica, I think it's your turn to start, right? Yeah.
I didn't realize you hadn't started. Have you started yet? But yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can jump in, and I just hate like being in positions where I feel like I'm a downer on some level, but a huge focus of the work of WRC and my past career, present day, historically, WRC has been around violence prevention, victim services, and mental health, right? Like those are still three huge issues that, you know, in our quest to be responsive to our community's needs, those are still the biggest issues, you know, 50 years of existence that we're dealing with. And so there are a lot of other issues that I'm hoping my fellow panelists will talk about, but for me, that's still something that it's so important to keep at the forefront. It's the fact that, you know, both our center and the LGBTQ center, we provide victim services and confidential support because we have to, because it's what our community is facing. It's the fact that, you know, those we love and those here, we all are at risk of violence right now, and we're more vulnerable. And I think kind of continuing that work, you know, the day that we no longer have to do gender violence prevention work would just be incredible, right? So that's a huge part of what I think is still an issue that we need to be talking about, because it's so easily to be gaslit that we don't have to talk about, even when it's everywhere around us. And I also think, right, that violence and that vulnerability is connected to everything. It's connected to white supremacy, it's connected to misogyny, it's connected to economic security. I mean, so here we are in like the hub of intersectionality. And for us, like I think how that's manifested has been our commitment to trauma-informed spaces and trauma-informed dynamics and relationships and cultures, of really flipping it. That's not about being strong and like sucking it up and like showing that, you know, we're fearless and indestructible. It's the fact that we really have to rethink how we're doing this work, and we really have to kind of reclaim, I think, the healing justice that's a huge part of the movement as well. I was 26 years old the first time I burnt out, right? That's really young to say like, whoa, I'm exhausted. I don't think I can do this work anymore. And that's when I got into trauma studies, and I started studying traditional medicine and going to ceremonies, because it felt like, you know, back in 2005, it was a while ago, that was really a missing piece in our movement, was that how do we not fall into the patterns of that of which we're trying to dismantle, right? Like, how do we not have oppression within our own agencies? How do we not have lateral violence? Like, how do we really deconstruct all of those pieces? I guess I'm not really completely answering the question, but I feel like, you know, that's the work that I wish I could get away from, in a sense, even though I love it, but it's also so critical and important. And I think it's something we need to model too. Like, we really need to model how, as change makers, as activists, as feminists, as, you know, queer justice, like activists, how we're also modeling, you know, everything we're trying to promote out there internally, like that we're taking care of ourselves, that we're taking care of each other, that we're really, really intentionally trying not to contribute to the harm of our communities and those we're fighting for, because, you know, sadly, we haven't had a lot of models like that. We've had incredible models, right, in terms of, and mentors and people to admire, and we still have a lot of work to do, I think, in finding out how do we like be fierce, strong, and resilient, and also gentle and tender, and all of that. That was a little bit of a tangent. Next.
No, I think that was great, Jessica. Thank you. No, I think, you know, the confidential advocacy piece, and that creating that space where I don't really believe that spaces can be truly safe, but safer. And creating, you know, those spaces I think are really important. And, you know, I think that being the director of an LGBTQ resource center is such a privilege, you know, and it's a privilege that I don't take lightly. You know, I think that for so many, like, this was not a job I ever thought I was going to have, right? Like, I did not, you know, in elementary school, what are you going to be when you grow up? Professionally queer was not on the list. It was, I was going to be, you know, the next Gloria Trevi, or I was going to be a lawyer. I don't, those are my two, you know, desires. I didn't either. But I think that part of the ways that we create more inclusive spaces is thinking about the ways that I have engaged in queerness, in ways that have been things that I've needed and things that I've experienced that were harmful. And so, you know, I think a big one is we still have to address safety. You know, it is still not safe to be trans and queer in the United States. You know, we know that Black trans women are being murdered at disproportionate rates. We know that trans and gender nonconforming individuals are experiencing unemployment and health discrimination and housing discrimination and food scarcity at alarmingly high rates, especially in New Mexico. We know that kids are still not comfortable coming out. You know, and while we've made great strides and it is exciting to see, you know, in media, larger queer representation, that representation isn't just enough. We have to start dismantling a lot of those patterns and behaviors. And I think that, you know, creating spaces of mentorship, you know, I didn't have a queer mentor. I didn't have queer people to look up to. You know, I'm 39 years old. The only queer person I could really think of that I saw that kind of looked like me was Pedro Zamora in Real World San Francisco, or Ricky from My So-Called Life. neither one who I wanted to be like. And so, I am so honored that I get to be in a space where I get to mentor young trans and queer individuals. And, that is, the Resource Center is, 10 this year. And that is work that I'm super proud of. I look at the students that we have, like AJ Hedrick, like William Campillo, the work that you, Pico, are doing, the work that Laz is doing, the work that, Rocky Cordova is doing. Those are just the names that come off the top of my head. So any student who's watching, I apologize. I can't name you all. But right, like the center is creating trans and queer excellence. And that to me is so exciting. And, we have to start also taking on, these bigger intersectional issues and uplifting, trans and queer, BIPOC voices. And, sitting in a moment where we have to acknowledge that the events that have happened these past 2 weeks, our Asian communities, who I think we often ignore or erase in struggle movements, are being attacked, right? And we have to uplift these voices. And it is not just my privilege, but it's also my responsibility as a director to make sure that I am holding space for these voices. And also for, admitting again when I step in it, admitting when I don't do enough, and figuring out how I can do better, and taking that responsibility upon myself, and not asking, other folks, other femmes to do that work for me, or expecting them to do that work for me. And I think that also, I really think it's important for us to name and dismantle toxic patterns within the trans and queer community. I think for so many individuals, they use their trans identity or their queerness as a way to absolve them from the harm that they do. And you can be toxic as hell and be queer, right? Like one does not cancel out the other. And I think that that's really important to address. And I also, and it is a passion of mine because of my personal experiences, but I want us to really identify and address grooming predatorial practices within specifically queer male communities. It happens so often. And I say queer male because that's the community I know of the most, right? But growing up as a young queer person, sexual violence was just thought of as something that happens. It is part of the norm. It's almost an expectation and rite of passage. And I want to dismantle that. And I think that, again, it goes back to body autonomy and really teaching young folks, right, that we can say no, and that if I am in a space and I make you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, I want to make sure that you have the tools to say, no, this feels uncomfortable to me, this feels gross to me, and I'm going to leave. And also making sure that we're creating spaces where if you leave those spaces, there's not going to be retribution. Because there is that fear, right? Of ostracization, of outing also. And that's why, I love the fact that the LGBTQ Resource Center is a confidential space, because I think that sometimes a lot of folks who aren't trans or queer forget that like that outing is still a really big fear. And that if I'm out at school, that doesn't mean I'm out in the rest of the world. I may only be out in spaces where I feel safe being so. And finally, I want us just to make sure that we're moving from surviving to thriving. Let's talk about trans and queer excellence. Let's talk about the fact that, trans and queer people, yes, it's still hard, but we can celebrate the joy and the beauty in our spaces and in our existences.
Yeah, I think thank you so much to my co-panelists. You all provided such a wealth of topics to answer this question. I think for me, as a scholar in trans studies and someone who's trans, and what I think of as, the key issues that we need to be talking about right now, I mean, we need to call on Biden to release all LGBTQ persons from detention centers, from immigration detention. I mean, that's something that the folks that I know and that I admire, like Bambi Salcedo and others, have been calling for the President of the United States, whoever it is, to do this for a really long time. And I think that our system of asylum that requires LGBTQ folks to narrate a specific cultural horrendousness that absolves the U.S. of its, politics, its participation in making their countries of origin so unstable, because and thus this is why we have LGBT folks coming to the U.S. as if it's easy to be LGBTQ in the U.S., which it's not. So I think asylum as a system doesn't necessarily further harms, further reopens that trauma. So for me, freeing folks from LGBTQ folks immigrant detention is a key issue. And then also we're in a moment where there's invigorated attacks on trans kids, right? So we have a lot of conservative bills that are being passed in conservative red lane states that really seek to harm the lives of trans kids and the futures that they are wanting to imagine and enact for themselves. And I think that's important for us to think about because, trans kids have always existed from, the turn of the 20th century. The idea of a trans kid is not anything new. And so those are a couple issues that really kind of come to mind, and to reiterate what Frankie mentioned about, really kind of looking to being allies and supportive of our Asian American LGBTQ folks and women in the Albuquerque area, especially at UNM. We don't really provide services for this particular community. And I think that if it's not being provided, then it does fall on those of us who are in these centers as directors to do that type of work and to build solidarity with these populations to assure that their needs are being met. And just to speak again to kind of houselessness and food insecurity and all of those things, like that's something that's really devastating in Albuquerque for sure. Living in a place like Albuquerque, and you can see so many homeless houses, tents, places where folks live, and to be able to pass that every day. I don't know how people do it, because I think that there's a lot of ways in which we all kind of intervene, getting connected with mutual aid work that's happening in Albuquerque and supporting various nonprofits and folks outside of the university as well who are doing that type of work. And for faculty, we need to encourage our students to explore those types of venues in and how they're understanding scholarship and kind of putting theory into practice. We need to give them the opportunities to branch out and to do community work around the issues and the concepts that we teach in the classroom.
Thank you all for presenting the many issues that a lot of people are facing within our communities. Before I go to the next question, I just want to remind people to drop your questions in the Q&A chat box. You can submit your questions anonymously if you want to. And for people who are tuning in through Facebook Live, you can go ahead and drop your questions in the comment section. So my next question is, how do we address misogyny and transphobia within feminist, queer, and trans communities and social movements?
I think it's my turn to start, right? Yeah. So I think that first we have to acknowledge that misogyny exists. I think that so many people are in these spaces of, oh, like we are, like when people say they're post-racial, they're like, you're post nothing, like we are still in it, we are, but we're having to unlearn these patterns. And I think that we collectively have to say, yes, we do participate unwillingly or not, or unknowingly or not, in these toxic patterns and behaviors, and addressing our own internal misogyny, and also making sure that we're creating equitable space for femme woman identified individuals. and not just let's create more space at the table, but also let's give up seats at the table for femme and women identified individuals. I think that so often we this fallacy of inclusion doesn't necessarily create equitable access. And I think that, I'm not going to bring the WRC onto an event just to say, look, we've ticked this box off. I'm not going to bring in the Feminist Research Institute and say, look, we are uplifting the scholarship. How are we doing it? Are we actively doing the work ourselves? And not expecting for femme woman labor to be the ones to bring us along, because I think that we've relied on it and we've depended on it for far too long. And I am constantly trying to figure out how to avoid that space. And I'm also constantly trying to figure out how to make sure that I'm not replicating those toxic behaviors.
I can go. I mean, for me, it's everything you just said, Frankie, and it's also just continuing to have conversations like these, and doing so with people you feel super comfortable with students, with colleagues, with your family. I think a lot of it is stepping into what Pico said, that third space and being more willing to. I know it's been successful for our center is also just really trusting student leadership and trusting that, our community is going to start telling us, like, these are the areas that, we need to focus on, that we need to shift. These are the experiences we're having in the classroom, and really noting those changes and leaning into them and seeing how we can just support the shifts. Right?
Yeah, I think for me, addressing misogyny and transphobia really just kind of, one of the first steps I think is really abandoning the attachments that we have to the constructions of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. I think that myself as a brown transmasculine person, there's so many things that are beautiful to me about brown masculinity, but misogyny is never ever one of those things. And I think that there's an assumption that to be able to live in the place of masculinity, that misogyny has to make its way into how you enact that masculinity. And I see this a lot in LGBT communities for sure, especially within lesbian communities specifically, right? Like the adoption of masculinity often goes hand in hand with very easy reproduction of misogyny in close partner relationships, and in kind of reproducing what we could think of as toxic masculinity. And for me, interrogating masculinity is something that we have to do and continue to do if we're really going to understand why trans hate motivated violence happens in the first place, and dislodging and imagining masculinity in different forms is kind of the first place that you start with that. And really kind of moving masculinity out of the pedestal from which we kind of hold it on. So for me, that's my kind of take on misogyny and transphobia. I think, I touched on it a little bit. I'm more kind of seeing addressing this through kind of the reproduction of misogyny through folks who embody masculinity and have attachments to masculinity. And I think reconfiguring and what masculinity means to you on your terms in terms of your body, and not replicating it based on what you think masculinity is supposed to be is a really good place to start to really get at transphobic violence, as I mentioned, for example. So for me, it's, masculinity is not a limited resource. There's lots of it to go around. We just have to really kind of understand, be mindful of the types of masculinities that we do reproduce, and we can still love all the things about masculinity that we love without having to embody and embrace all of the things that do harm to women and women identified folks in our lives.
Thank you all for that. Now, before we go into our last question, I just would like to recommend everybody who is attending this panel today to please check out the amazing work of all three of these directors, the Women's Research Center, the UNM LGBTQ Research Center, and the Feminist Research Institute. Each one of these directors are putting out amazing queer feminist focused, not only research, but developed work that's really helping a lot of students on campus. Now for the last question, what do you imagine as the future of feminism?
I think it's my turn to start again. The future of feminism, I mean, I think the future of feminism continues to be futurity lies in how we are reimagining our worlds and working towards, you know, making that a reality for ourselves and for our communities based on what that means to you. And I think for me, as I mentioned, the pressing issues for me are always first and foremost going to be improving the lives of trans women of color, and then, you know, trans folks more broadly. I think the future of feminism is trans women of color, but not in this tokenist type of way. It's, you know, about, you know, also white trans folks really kind of releasing some of their attachments around normative masculinity and normative femininity, and being more attentive to issues around citizenship and economic insecurity, food insecurity, right? Like really kind of understanding how race has to inform any kind of radical trans politic. The racial politic has to be there. And we even we didn't really discuss like ability, disability, that formation of politics within feminism. I do think that there's so many places, moments for great intersectionality in kind of imagining the future of feminism. And so for me, when I think of issues, I want to think about, you know, how I can have a multifaceted approach to who's imagined as kind of the what's imagined as the end goal, or like the political kind of like the political apparatus that we're using in our politics in how we're enacting feminism, you know, isn't detached from our daily lives and how we move through the world. And so the future of feminism, I think, is both in the individual and in the collective. And so kind of understanding your responsibilities to the collective, and then the changes that you make individually in your own kind of microcosms of the world that you live in. That's kind of a feature of feminism for me. You know, how do we bring together various identity politics and forms and formations together to, you know, improve the lives, as I mentioned, of trans women of color. How do we enact the politics that's going to center them in their needs? Because, you know, if they're free, then I think that will greatly improve the lives of so many other people.
Yeah, I echo all of that. Thank you, Frank. And I think for me, I feel really lucky right now. And I found myself saying that a lot the past 4 years under the last administration and where we are in history, because I don't really have to imagine it too much, because I get to see it and witness it and interact with it every single day. It's the students that come into our space. It's the conversations we're having here. To me, you know, the future of feminism is here, and it's now, and it's so alive, and it's so on fire. I know we're running short on time, but I just want to acknowledge that this campus, right, in New Mexico, you know, the Women's Studies and Gender, wait, we have a new name now, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. Sorry about that. There's lots of new naming, but that department and WRC are 50 years old next year. Like, these are two of the oldest programs in our country. And in a time where we've seen other universities and institutions kind of making things smaller, combining ethnic centers into multicultural centers, combining LGBTQ centers with women's centers into these gender, you know, spectrum, like, we're just mushing together at other universities, right? Taking away resources and combining things. And one of the one of the things I really try to stay rooted in right now, and in these past years, was that on this campus, that's not what's happening, right? Like our students and our voices and our faculty and our collective is getting stronger. We have 4 different entities that are committed to gender justice work on this campus, and are getting stronger and bigger and collaborating more. So I'm really hopeful. I get tired sometimes thinking about where is this all going, but I have a lot of faith and a lot of hope because we're seeing changes right now, and they're good changes.
Yeah, I feel like Jessica and Frank said it all. But I think personally, the future of feminism, I want to go back to a non-corporatized idea of what feminism is supposed to look like, right? Like, I think that sometimes are the ways that we have created these notions of feminism are really toxic and are really capitalist. And I think that it is really damaging to movements as a whole, you know, because I think feminism is intersectional, and I think it is it's a multitude of struggles. And I think that in order for feminism to move forward, we have to acknowledge those, and we have to, you know, we have to be not afraid to get a little messy, you know, because all politics, whether they are personal or political or, you know, cultural, whatever they are going to be inherently messy. And the only way that we can move forward is to acknowledge our own. And by acknowledging our own, then we can start helping address others. And I'm a real big believer in the micro heals the macro. And so we have to start working on our internal, and then we can move out forward. And I think that the, you know, beautiful revolutionary spaces that we imagine are possible, but it's only going to be possible together and not alone.
Thank you all so much for your wisdom. We do have 2 questions in the chat box. So the first one is, what can UNM as an institution do to create inclusive spaces? What is the institution lacking?
Funding. No, but I actually do. I think that like we need to fund all 3 of our departments more. You know, I think about what I could do if we had more money. You know, I think about the amazing work that WRC and the Feminist Research Institute could do as well if we just had more resources.
Mm-hmm.
I won't object to that. I think too, what a lot of our centers could, I think, kind of overcoming preconceived ideas about our centers. I know that a lot of the student centers that are more identity-based, there's assumptions that like, oh, that space is not a safe space for me, or I don't know if I want to walk into that space. When my first year at WRC, I heard all sorts of rumors about what we really did at WRC. And so I think for us too, it's being really proactive in terms of welcoming people in and letting them know that this space is your space too. We want to hear from you. We want to inform you. I take pride in WRC that once we get people through the doors, usually they find that they feel like they can relax, that they can be seen and express themselves to their fullest abilities. So I think that's part of all of it as well.
Just to chime in really quickly, I think what UNM can do as an institution to create inclusive spaces, I think that you know, healthcare is someplace that all institutions really kind of need to work on. Trans health, right? So finding a primary care provider in general, I think is hard for almost anyone if you're trans or not, but finding a primary care provider as a trans person is even harder. To find someone to find a medical professional who's going to be willing to have the kind of soft touch you need to have with trans folks, in terms of trans folks have a lot of agency over what healthcare looks for us in terms of what we want to do with our bodies. And we're extremely educated about what we need for our bodies and for our health. And I think the medical profession doesn't necessarily invite that. So, you know, one of the things that the FRI is doing is I worked with the Health Sciences Center to organize a panel on trans health it's going to be taking place on Monday, I believe, and it's geared more towards like med students and providers. But these are some of the steps that we need to do to really make sure that our trans students and faculty and staff, right, who are, getting care at UNM hospitals and doctors, that our providers, aren't going to be saying inappropriate things or be combative or, not supportive. And I'm not sure what insurance looks like for students, how comprehensive it is, but I'm sure it's probably not enough. So healthcare as a minimum is a big place where UNM probably has lots to grow. And even if they're great at it, we should want to be the best at it.
Thank you. And our last question is, thank you so much. This is such a healing space. I wonder genuinely if you see value still in spaces for female identified folks only, i.e. for survivors of sexual violence. And if so, what do you think are best practices / language for making these spaces trans inclusive?
I'll start. I think that it is crucial that we have specific spaces, right? I think that it is crucial that we have spaces that are just for specific groups. And I think the way that we can say, though, right, if we're going to say this is a woman's space, who is included in that definition? And I think it's okay to sometimes say that this is a cis woman space. This is a space that is included in all women individuals, right? And when we talk about like non-binary identities in particular, I think that we are often, non-binary becomes a synonym for femme. And so I think that like a lot of non-binary spaces become like mask exclude, they don't include mask identities. And so I think that just using very intentional language is the ways that we create these spaces. And I think that they are important.
Gosh, I really appreciate that question, and it's really complex. I'll say it that much. And I appreciate your perspective, Frankie, because my instinct has been like historically survivor spaces that I have worked in have been very inclusive, right? And it's, I also understand people's need. Sorry, I just got a I'm supposed to be in a meeting, sorry, it just popped up. I also understand safety concerns and people's needs. I can't see WRC as an entity ever doing a survivor space that is explicitly only for cis women. It's just not kind of who we are and how we have operated. However, if we had a cis woman who really was saying that that's what they needed, you better believe we would look into the community to see where we could find it. I wish I had like the clear answer for this one, but I think it's something that we're still kind of trying to figure out. I think we have a big history too, and a current thing of erasing male victims in sexual violence. And I know from personal family members and stories that the safest place that, they felt was in a healing space with like other women who were survivors, like, and there was something beautiful that happened in that. But I also know that not everybody is there. So I can tell you what WRC would do, but I also think I'm always about honoring like what people identify as kind of their limits as survivors and what they're safe with, and trying to meet that with what feels right for them.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'll say I think there's definitely still value in spaces that are for female identified folks. I think some of the best practices are to abandon this notion that trans people are nefarious interlopers in these spaces, because they're not, right? Trans women aren't seeking out these spaces to intervene in them and change them or dominate them or any way. Just understanding that if it's a space that's around things like survival of sexual violence and sexual assault, I mean, the a biological definition of womanhood isn't what is bringing people together, and I don't subscribe to that particular logic, and And I think that the moment that we let go of the trans woman as this kind of menacing figure, which has been inculcated into us through representation, um, if we once we let go of that, then women only spaces, you know, can have a different can be different and can be as inclusive as we would want to imagine them to be. So that's my kind of take on that particular question. And thank you for the question.
All right, well, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who attended. And this concludes our Queering Feminism panel. And once again, happy Women's History Month.